still think about that night more than I probably should. It has been almost 3 years now, and I have told this story to maybe 4 or 5 people total, because every time I tell it, I can see in their eyes that they think I am exaggerating, or that I fell asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing up. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I need to write it down properly, once, so that at least somewhere it exists as more than just a story I mumble about after a couple of drinks. I was 26 at the time, working a delivery road for a regional auto parts company based out of Ohio. My job was simple on paper. I drove a box truck between 3 states, dropping off parts to small repair shops that were too far out for the big chains to bother servicing quickly. It paid decent, the hours were long, and most nights I was driving well past midnight just to make my scheduled drop-offs on time. I had done this job for about 1.5 years by that point, so long stretches of empty highway did not bother me anymore. I had my routine: coffee, a podcast, and a general awareness of which truck stops had decent bathrooms and which ones you should avoid unless it was an emergency. The night this happened, I was driving through a rural stretch of Pennsylvania, somewhere between 2 small towns that I genuinely could not point to on a map anymore if you asked me. It was late October, cold enough that I had the heater running, and the kind of dark that only exists out in the countryside, where there are no street lights and the trees on either side of the road just swallow up your headlights. I remember the date only because it was 2 days before Halloween, and I remember thinking how appropriate the weather felt. Foggy and damp, like something out of an old movie. My gas light came on around 11:30 at night. I was not panicking because I had passed a gas station sign about 10 miles back advertising fuel, and my GPS showed another one coming up in about 6 miles. Still, 6 miles when your tank is basically empty and you are driving a loaded box truck is not exactly comfortable, so I kept my eyes open for anything sooner. That is when I saw the station. It was not on my GPS, which I found strange even then, but I did not think much of it at the time, because rural GPS data is often outdated or incomplete. The sign was old, one of those big elevated signs on rusted metal poles, and half the letters were either burned out or missing entirely, so all I could make out was something like UEL and a price that had clearly not been updated in years. The station itself sat back from the road a little, with a small convenience store attached, the kind with a single row of fluorescent lights inside, and those old-style pumps that still had the mechanical numbers instead of digital screens. I pulled in because I did not have much of a choice. There was one other vehicle in the lot, an old pickup truck parked at an angle near the store. Like whoever parked it was not too concerned about being neat about it. No other cars, no other people that I could see. The lights inside the store were on, but dim, almost like half the bulbs were dying. I got out, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just quiet in the way rural areas are quiet, but quiet in a way that felt wrong, if that makes sense. No bugs, no wind moving through the trees, nothing. I remember standing there for a second just listening, and it struck me that I could hear my own heartbeat, which is not something I usually notice. I walked up to the pump and tried my card, but the reader was one of those where you had to go inside and pay first, an old-school setup that some rural stations still use, so I walked toward the store. The door had one of those old-fashioned bells attached to it, and when I pushed it open, the bell rang with this strange, slightly off-pitch sound, like it had been ringing that exact way for 50 years and was just starting to wear out. Inside, the store looked frozen in time. The shelves were stocked, but everything on them looked like it belonged in a museum. Soda cans with designs I had not seen since I was a kid, cigarette brands I did not even recognize, a rack of magazines with covers that looked decades old. The floor tiles were cracked in places, and there was a faint smell in the air, something like old wood and something else underneath it that I could not quite place, something almost metallic. Behind the counter stood a man, maybe in his 60s, thin, wearing a flannel shirt that looked too big for him. He did not look up right away. He was writing something in a notebook, slow and deliberate, like he was in no hurry at all. When he finally did look up, he smiled at me in a way that I want to describe as polite. But there was something underneath the politeness that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was the kind of smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Evening," he said. His voice was raspy, like he had not used it in a while. "Help you find something?" I told him I just needed to pay for gas, pump too. He nodded slowly and told me to go ahead and pump, that I could come back and settle up after. That struck me as a little odd, since he had not asked for a card or any kind of pre-authorization, but I was tired and just wanted to get back on the road, so I did not think too much of it. I walked back out to the truck and started pumping. The number wheels on the pump clicked slowly, mechanically, the way I imagined gas pumps sounded decades ago. While I was standing there, I noticed something odd about the pickup truck parked near the store. The driver's side window was down despite the cold, and there was a thin layer of what looked like dust or dirt settled on the dashboard inside, the kind of dust that builds up over weeks, maybe longer. It did not look like a truck that had been driven there that same night. It looked like it had been sitting in that exact spot for a long time. That is when I started to feel that specific kind of unease that is hard to put into words. Nothing had happened yet. Nobody had threatened me, but every small detail was starting to stack up into something that felt wrong, the kind of wrong your gut recognizes before your brain can explain it. I finished pumping, and the total came out to some oddly specific number, something like $18 and something cents, back when gas prices made a full tank cost quite a bit more than that even at older prices. It felt off, but I told myself maybe this was some kind of old promotional pricing or a mistake in the ancient equipment. I walked back inside to pay. The man was still behind the counter, still writing in his notebook. When I approached, he set the pen down and looked at me again with that same smile. "You are new around here," he said. It was not a question. I told him I was just passing through on a delivery route. He nodded like this confirmed something he already suspected. Then he said something that I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. "Not many folks stop here anymore. Used to be busier." I asked him how business had been, just making small talk while I got my wallet out. He said something vague, something like business had slowed down a lot since they changed the road a few years back, rerouting traffic somewhere else. I remember thinking that made sense, since the station clearly was not on any modern GPS. While he was ringing me up on an old cash register, the kind with actual mechanical buttons, I glanced toward a door behind the counter, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room or office. Through the gap I could see part of a wall, and on that wall were several old photographs, the kind you get printed at a drugstore, slightly faded with time. I could not make out details from where I stood, but something about the way they were arranged struck me as strange, almost like a memorial wall. I paid in cash because the register clearly was not built for cards, and the man counted my change slowly, his fingers moving with a kind of careful precision. As he handed it back, his hand brushed mine, and I remember it being unnaturally cold, colder than the temperature outside would explain. "Careful driving tonight," he said. "Fog gets bad out this way. Some folks don't make it through." I laughed it off, a nervous kind of laugh, and told him I would be careful. He did not laugh with me. He just kept that same still smile and watched me as I walked to the door. Right as I reached for the door handle, I glanced back one more time, and for just a second, I could have sworn the shadow behind him, cast against the wall by the dim fluorescent light, did not match his posture. He was standing straight, hands resting on the counter, but the shadow looked hunched, elongated in a way that did not correspond to his body at all. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that the bulbs were old and flickering, and that my imagination was running away from me because of how unsettling the whole encounter had felt. I walked out fast, faster than I meant to, and got into my truck. As I started the engine, I glanced at the store window one more time, and the man was standing there close to the glass, just watching me. He had not been anywhere near the window a few seconds earlier. I do not know how he got there so quickly. I pulled out of that lot and got back onto the highway, my hands shaking slightly on the wheel, telling myself over and over that I was just tired, that it was late, that my mind was playing tricks on me the way tired minds do on long, dark drives. I drove for another 20 minutes or so before I started to calm down, and I turned my podcast back on, trying to get my mind onto something normal. About 30 minutes after leaving that station, I stopped at a proper truck stop, one of those large, well-lit ones with a fast food place attached in a parking lot full of long-haul trucks. I went inside for coffee, mostly just to be around other people for a few minutes. While I was in line, I overheard two truck drivers talking near the register, and one of them mentioned a gas station a while back, describing it in a way that made my stomach turn cold. He was telling the other driver to avoid a station off the old highway, the one with the broken sign, saying that he had heard from other drivers that stopping there brings bad luck, or worse. The other driver laughed it off the way I had, but the first one was serious, saying that a station used to be there decades ago, run by a family, until something happened there that shut it down. He said the county eventually rerouted the road entirely, in part because so many drivers reported strange experiences near that spot, though nobody could ever explain exactly why. He said the building was supposed to have been torn down years ago after it changed hands and eventually got abandoned. I did not say anything. I just paid for my coffee, sat down at a table near the window, and tried to process what I had just heard. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation, some rural legend built up over the years, an old building somebody still occasionally checked on, or a caretaker who lived out that way and had inherited an odd sense of humor. I wanted so badly for there to be a normal explanation. The next morning, once I finished my deliveries and had some daylight and a full night's sleep behind me, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the general area on my phone, trying to find anything about a gas station along that stretch of highway. I found an old local news archive digitized from a small regional paper mentioning a gas station that had closed decades earlier after the owner disappeared and was never found. Investigators at the time apparently found the store fully stocked, the register full of cash, and no sign of forced entry or struggle, as if the owner had simply vanished mid-shift. The article said the family who owned it had run it for 2 generations and that the disappearance was never solved. I do not know for certain that the man I talked to that night was connected to that story. I want to believe there is some normal explanation, a caretaker, a strange local tradition, anything logical. But I have driven that route dozens of times since then, deliberately looking for that station, and I have never been able to find it again. Not the building, not the sign, nothing. The road itself is there, I know the exact stretch, but where that station once stood, there is now just an overgrown patch of gravel and weeds, like nothing was ever built there at all. I still make that same delivery run every few months, and every single time I pass that stretch of highway, I make absolutely sure my tank is full before I get anywhere close. I have never told my dispatcher why I always fuel up so far in advance. I have never told most of my friends the full story, because I know how it sounds. But whenever late October rolls around, and I find myself driving through rural stretches of highway after dark, I think about that station, about the cold in that man's hand, about that shadow that did not match his body, and about the fact that no matter how many times I search for that place in daylight, it is simply not there anymore. I am not asking anyone to believe me. I am just telling you what happened, as accurately as I can remember it, because some nights I still cannot shake the feeling that somewhere out there, along a forgotten stretch of Pennsylvania highway, that store is still open, waiting for the next driver whose gaslight comes on at exactly the wrong moment. Now we start our second story. This happened almost 2 years ago, back when I was working night shifts as a clerk at a gas station, just off a state highway in rural Nevada. I want to say up front that I am not someone who normally believes in ghost stories or anything supernatural. I grew up pretty practical, the kind of person who assumes there is always a logical explanation for strange things. But what happened to me during those few months working that job changed something in how I think about certain things, and I still do not have a full explanation for it, even now. The station was called Desert Fuel, though most locals just called it the station on 95, since that was the only real landmark for miles in either direction. It was one of those isolated places you see in movies about long American road trips, hours of flat desert on either side, mountains far off in the distance, and almost no cell signal unless you stood in a specific spot near the ice machine outside. I took the job because it paid slightly better than anything else available in the small town I lived in, and because the schedule worked around the community college classes I was taking during the day. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, 4 nights a week. For the first month or so, nothing unusual happened at all. It was mostly quiet, the occasional trucker coming through, a handful of tourists driving overnight to avoid the daytime heat, and long stretches where I was completely alone with nothing but the hum of the refrigerators and whatever podcast I had going on my phone. The strange stuff started around my 6th week on the job, and it began with something small enough that I almost did not think anything of it. Around 2 in the morning, the station's phone rang. We had an old landline behind the counter that almost nobody used anymore, since most customers just came in person or called the manager's cell if there was an issue. I picked it up, said the usual greeting, and there was nothing on the other end. Not silence exactly, more like a kind of static, distant and uneven, almost like wind blowing across a microphone. I hung up, assumed it was some kind of glitch or a wrong number, and did not think much more about it. It happened again the following week. Same time, almost exactly 2 in the morning. Same static sound. This time I stayed on the line a little longer, and right before I hung up, I thought I heard something underneath the static, something that almost sounded like a voice, faint and warped, saying a single word that I could not make out clearly. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just interference on an old phone line, nothing more. Around the same time, I started noticing something odd with the security cameras. The station had 4 cameras total, 1 covering the register, 1 on the front door, 1 on the pumps outside, and 1 in the back storage room. The footage fed into an old monitor behind the counter that the manager rarely bothered to check unless there was a specific incident to review. Late at night, when things were slow, I would sometimes glance at the monitor out of boredom, and every so often, on the camera covering the pumps outside, I would catch what looked like a figure standing near the edge of the lot, right where the light from the station stopped and the darkness of the desert began. Whenever I looked up from the monitor and out through the front window to check in person, there was nothing there. No one standing outside, no cars, nothing. At first I assumed it was some kind of camera artifact, a smudge on the lens, a trick of shadows from the pump lights, but it kept happening, always around the same time, roughly between 1 and 3 in the morning, and always in that same spot at the edge of the lot. After a couple of weeks of this, I started to notice something else. The figure, if that is even the right word for it, never moved on camera. It just stood there, facing the station, for a few seconds at a time, and then it would simply not be there in the next frame, without any visible motion of walking away. I mentioned this to my manager during a shift change one morning, trying to sound casual about it, like I was just curious whether the cameras had known issues. He got quiet for a second, then told me that a previous clerk who worked that same night shift a couple of years earlier had quit rather suddenly, and had mentioned something similar before leaving, though he had assumed at the time that the guy was just messing with him or dealing with exhaustion from working nights. He said the company never bothered replacing or upgrading those cameras because there had never been an actual security incident, just some strange footage every so often that nobody could really explain. He told me not to worry about it, that it was probably just old equipment malfunctioning, And that was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. I wanted to believe that. I really did. For a while, I managed to convince myself that it was nothing more than a mix of old wiring, my own exhaustion from working overnight shifts while also taking morning classes, and a fairly active imagination combined with too many hours alone in an isolated building at night. Then came the night about 2 months into the job that I still cannot fully explain, no matter how many times I go over it in my head. It was a slow night. Nobody had come in for almost 2 hours, and I was restocking a shelf near the back of the store when I heard the bell on the front door chime, signaling someone had walked in. I called out a greeting without turning around right away, figuring it was probably a trucker or someone passing through. When I turned to walk to the front, the store was empty. No one was there. The door was closed. I checked the security footage right away, rewinding it on the monitor, and the front door camera clearly showed the door opening on its own, swinging inward slightly and then closing again, with absolutely nobody visible walking through it. I remember standing behind the counter after that, completely still, my heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I had just watched. Doors do not open themselves without wind or some mechanical malfunction, and it was a completely calm night outside, no breeze at all based on the flag hanging near the pumps, which had not moved all evening. About 20 minutes after that, the phone rang again. It was not 2 a.m. this time. It was closer to 12:30, breaking the pattern I had noticed before. I almost did not answer it, but something made me pick it up anyway. This time, the static was louder, and underneath it, I heard that same warped voice again, except this time I understood the word clearly. It said, very slowly, almost stretched out unnaturally, the word outside. I hung up immediately, and I remember my hands were shaking. I looked toward the front window, out toward the pumps, and standing right at the edge of the lot, in that exact same spot from the camera footage, was a figure. A real one this time, visible directly through the window, not through a screen. It was too dark to make out many details, but I could tell it was tall, unnaturally still, and facing directly toward the store, toward me specifically, even though there was no way it could have seen me clearly through the glare on the window from where it stood. I did not go outside. I did not call out. I just stood frozen behind the counter, watching it, for what felt like several minutes, but was probably closer to 30 seconds based on the timestamps I checked later on the security footage. Then, exactly like on the earlier recordings, it was simply gone in the next moment, without any visible movement of it walking away into the desert darkness. I finished the rest of that shift with every light in the store turned on, refusing to go near the front window again, counting down the minutes until my manager showed up for the morning changeover. When I told him what had happened, in full detail this time, he did not dismiss it the way he had before. He got quiet again, and eventually admitted that he had heard rumors from years back, from before he even started managing that location, about a young man who had been struck and killed by a vehicle on that stretch of highway late at night, right around where the edge of the station's lot now sat, back before the station itself had even been built. He said he never gave the story much thought, because it sounded like the kind of local legend every small town seems to have. I gave my notice 2 weeks after that night. I told the manager I had gotten a better opportunity somewhere else, closer to the community college, which was true, but was not really the actual reason I decided to leave so suddenly. I never went back to that station again, not even during the day, and I have avoided that stretch of highway entirely whenever I have had the choice to take an alternate route. To this day, I do not know exactly what I saw standing at the edge of that lot, or whose voice I heard through that old phone line saying that single word. I do not know if it was connected to the story my manager eventually told me, or something else entirely that has nothing to do with any local legend. What I do know is that some nights, when I am driving somewhere late and pull into an isolated gas station for fuel, I find myself glancing toward the edges of the lot, toward wherever the light from the building stops and the darkness begins, half expecting to see something standing there, perfectly still, just watching. Now we start our third story. I want to start by saying that I am generally a skeptical person. I do not scare easily, and up until the night I am about to describe, I had never experienced anything I could not explain with logic. This happened almost 4 years ago now, back when I was a graduate student finishing up my degree, and it still bothers me enough that I avoid a certain type of situation because of it, even now. I was driving home from a friend's wedding in northern Michigan, heading back down toward Indiana, where I was living at the time. It was late November, already dark by 6 in the evening that far north, and I had a good 6 hours of driving ahead of me. I was alone in the car, which was normal for me, since I had done that same drive several times before, for various reasons. Visiting family, going to conferences, that sort of thing. About 2 hours into the drive, snow started coming down harder than the forecast had predicted. It was not a blizzard exactly, but visibility was getting worse, and the roads were starting to get slick in patches. I decided it would be smarter to stop for gas earlier than I normally would, both to top off the tank in case conditions got worse and to give myself a short break from the tense driving. I pulled off at an exit that had a single gas station visible from the highway, a fairly standard-looking place, well lit, with a small attached convenience store and about 6 pumps under a metal canopy. There were 2 other cars in the lot when I arrived, which felt reassuring, since an empty station in bad weather can feel unsettling in a way that is hard to explain unless you have experienced it yourself. I got out, and the cold hit me immediately. That sharp kind of cold that feels different from anywhere else, the kind that seems to come with lake-effect snow in that part of the country. I started pumping gas, and while I stood there, I noticed a woman standing near the entrance of the convenience store, just off to the side, not going in or out, just standing there in a light jacket that did not look nearly warm enough for the weather. She was not doing anything unusual on the surface, just standing, maybe waiting for someone. I did not think much of it at first. About halfway through pumping my gas, she started walking slowly toward my car. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease, mostly just because it was late and dark and I was a woman traveling alone, so any unexpected approach from a stranger tends to put you on alert regardless of the specific situation. As she got closer, I could see her more clearly under the station lights. She looked to be in her 30s maybe, with damp hair like she had been out in the snow for a while without a hood or hat, and her expression was strange, somewhere between confused and desperate. She asked me, in a voice that was surprisingly calm, given how she looked, whether I had seen a little boy anywhere near the station. She said her son had wandered off while she was inside paying, and she could not find him anywhere. I told her I had not seen anyone like that, and asked if she wanted me to help her look, or if she had already told the store clerk so they could check the security cameras. She nodded slowly, thanked me, and then turned and walked back toward the side of the building, disappearing around the corner into the darker area near the back of the station where the dumpsters and delivery entrance were located. Something about the whole interaction felt off, but I could not immediately put my finger on why. I finished pumping my gas, and then, feeling a mix of concern and civic obligation, I decided to go inside and mention it to the clerk, just in case it was a real emergency and the mother needed help coordinating a search or calling for assistance. Inside, the clerk was a young guy, maybe college age, sitting behind the counter scrolling through his phone. I told him what had happened, that a woman outside said her son was missing and had gone looking around the back of the building. He looked up at me with a strange expression, somewhere between confusion and concern, but not the kind of concern I expected, given what I had just told him. He asked me to describe the woman. I did, mentioning the damp hair, the light jacket, her general age and appearance. He got quiet for a moment then told me, in a voice that was noticeably more careful than before, that no woman matching that description had come into the store that night, and that he had been at the register the entire time, meaning he would have seen anyone walk in. I remember feeling a strange chill at that, telling myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe she had come in before his shift started, or maybe there was some other entrance I did not know about. I asked if he could check the security footage just to be sure, mostly because I wanted to rule out anything sinister, like an actual missing child situation that needed real attention. He pulled up the footage on an old monitor behind the counter, and we went back through the last 20 minutes together. The camera covering the front of the store and the pumps showed my car clearly, showed me pumping gas, but at no point did it show a woman anywhere near the entrance, near my car, or walking toward the back of the building. There was no one else visible on that footage during the entire time I described. I stood there staring at the screen, trying to reconcile what I had just watched with what I clearly remembered seeing and hearing only minutes earlier. The clerk, to his credit, did not dismiss me or act like I was crazy. Instead, he got noticeably more serious and asked me to describe again exactly where she had walked when she went around the side of the building. I told him, and his face changed in a way that I still think about. He told me, somewhat reluctantly, that the back area of the station, near the delivery entrance, had been the site of an accident a few years earlier, before he started working there, where a young mother and her son had been involved in some kind of incident during a snowstorm, very similar to the one happening that night. He was vague on the exact details, either because he genuinely did not know them fully or because he did not want to say more. But he mentioned that some of the longer-tenured employees avoided going near that back area alone during winter storms, treating it almost as an informal rule, without ever fully explaining why to newer staff. At that point, I asked him directly whether he thought I had seen a ghost, half expecting him to laugh it off. He did not laugh. He just said that he personally had never seen anything himself in the time he had worked there, but that enough other employees had described similar experiences. Women appearing near the back of the building on snowy nights, asking about a missing child, for him to take it seriously rather than dismiss it outright. We went outside together, mostly because I did not want to walk back to my car alone at that point. And we checked around the back of the building just to be thorough, half hoping to find some mundane explanation. A real woman who had simply walked off before the cameras caught her. Maybe someone experiencing a mental health crisis who needed real help rather than anything supernatural. There was no one there, just the dumpsters, the delivery entrance, and fresh snow that had not been disturbed by any footprints other than our own. I got back in my car after that, and I remember sitting there for a full minute before starting the engine, trying to process everything that had just happened. Part of me wanted to drive away immediately and never think about it again, and part of me felt an odd sense of sadness, wondering if what I had seen was some kind of echo of a real tragedy, a mother endlessly searching for a son she could never find, trapped in some kind of loop tied to that specific location and those specific weather conditions. I drove the rest of the way home much more cautiously than I normally would, checking my rearview mirror far more often than necessary, and I remember calling a friend just to have someone to talk to on the phone during the last hour of the drive, mostly just to keep my mind occupied with something normal. In the weeks that followed, my curiosity got the better of me, and I started searching online for any information about accidents near that specific exit and gas station. I did eventually find a very brief mention in an old regional news archive about a car accident during a winter storm years earlier, involving a mother and her young son, though the article was frustratingly short on details and did not specify the exact location beyond the general area of that highway exit. I could not confirm with certainty that it was connected to the exact station I had stopped at, but the timing and circumstances lined up closely enough that it was hard to dismiss as pure coincidence. I have driven past that same exit a handful of times since then, on trips back and forth between Michigan and Indiana, and every single time, I choose to stop somewhere else, even if it means driving an extra 20 minutes out of my way or risking a lower tank of gas than I would normally be comfortable with. I have never told the clerk's story to very many people, mostly because I know exactly how it sounds, and I do not necessarily expect anyone else to believe it the way I experienced it. But every winter, when the first heavy snow starts falling, and I find myself driving alone at night, I think about that woman standing near the entrance of that station, her hair damp despite the cold, calmly asking a complete stranger if I had seen her son anywhere nearby. And I wonder if I had followed her around that corner that night instead of going inside first, what exactly I might have found waiting for me back there in the dark. Now we start our fourth story. I have hesitated for a long time about whether to write this one down, mostly because unlike some of the stranger experiences people talk about, this one does not involve anything supernatural. No ghosts, no unexplained figures, nothing like that. What happened to me was entirely human, and honestly, that is what makes it stick with me the way it does. Sometimes the scariest things are not the ones you cannot explain. They are the ones you can. This happened about 5 years ago when I was 22, fresh out of college, driving across the country by myself for the first time. I had just accepted a job offer in Arizona, and rather than fly out and ship my things separately, I decided to drive my car across the country myself, mostly because I wanted the experience of a solo cross-country road trip before starting full-time work. Looking back, I still do not regret the decision, even after everything that happened. But I definitely think about safety very differently now than I did back then. I was somewhere in New Mexico on the third day of my drive when it happened. It was late afternoon, not even dark yet, which is part of why what happened felt so unsettling, since none of the usual assumptions about nighttime danger applied. I had stopped at a gas station just off the interstate, a fairly normal-looking place attached to a small diner, with a handful of cars in the lot and a couple of truckers fueling up their rigs nearby. I went inside first to use the restroom and grab a snack before continuing on, and that is when I first noticed him, though at the time I did not think anything of it. A man, maybe in his 40s, standing near the coffee station, not doing anything particularly unusual, just pouring himself a cup of coffee slowly, almost too slowly, like he was in no hurry at all despite there being other customers waiting behind him. I remember him glancing at me briefly as I walked past toward the restroom, a look that lasted maybe half a second too long to feel completely normal, but nothing dramatic enough that I registered it as a real warning sign at the time. When I came out of the restroom, he was gone, and I did not think about him again as I paid for my snacks and walked back out to my car. I started pumping gas, and it was while I was standing there that I first noticed a gray sedan parked a few spots down from me, engine running, with the same man sitting in the driver's seat. He was not doing anything overtly threatening, just sitting there, but something about the way he was positioned, angled slightly toward my car, rather than facing forward like someone waiting to leave, made me feel watched in a way I could not fully rationalize. I told myself I was being paranoid, that solo female travelers are sometimes overly cautious in ways that are not always warranted, and that plenty of people sit in their cars at gas stations for completely mundane reasons, waiting on a phone call, finishing a meal, whatever it might be. I finished pumping my gas, got in my car, and pulled back onto the interstate, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. About 10 minutes later, I noticed the same gray sedan a few cars behind me on the highway. I told myself this did not necessarily mean anything either, since plenty of vehicles heading in the same direction on the same interstate would naturally end up near each other for stretches at a time. I kept driving, watching my mirrors more than I normally would, and after about 20 more minutes, the sedan took an exit and disappeared from view. I remember feeling a wave of relief, convincing myself that I had simply let my imagination get the better of me. About an hour later, running low on gas again since I had a smaller tank than ideal for long highway stretches, I pulled off at another station, a different one, well off from where I had seen the sedan earlier. This station felt more isolated, fewer cars, a single attendant visible through the window of the small booth near the entrance. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease, just based on how quiet it was compared to the earlier stop. But I needed gas, so I pulled up to a pump and got out. I was maybe 2 minutes into fueling when the same gray sedan pulled into the lot, parking at a pump not directly next to mine, but close enough that it did not feel like a coincidence anymore. My stomach dropped in a way I can still feel clearly when I think back on it. The same man got out, moving with an unhurried, deliberate pace, and instead of going toward the pump he had parked at, he started walking directly toward the store entrance, on a path that would take him fairly close to where I was standing. I did not wait to see what would happen next. I got back in my car immediately, left the pump handle in without even bothering to put it back properly, and drove out of that station as fast as I safely could, watching my mirrors the entire time. I did not see the gray sedan following immediately, but I was too rattled to feel any real relief. I called my mother from the road, mostly just to have someone on the phone with me, and told her what had happened, downplaying it slightly because I did not want her to panic, but explaining enough that she understood I was genuinely scared. She told me to call the police non-emergency line for the area I was in and report what had happened, which I did, though there was not much they could tell me beyond advising me to stay in well-populated, well-lit areas, and to trust my instincts if something continued to feel wrong. I drove for another hour after that, deliberately taking a slightly different route than my GPS originally suggested, just in case, before finally deciding I needed to stop for the night at a hotel, rather than continuing to push toward my original planned destination. I chose a hotel that was part of a larger, well-lit complex near a busy exit, specifically because it felt safer than anywhere more isolated. I want to be clear that nothing more happened that night. I checked in, went straight to my room, and did not leave again until morning. But the next day, continuing my drive, I made a point of being far more careful about where I stopped for gas, choosing only stations that were busy, well-lit, and attached to larger travel centers, rather than smaller, more isolated locations, even if it meant occasionally pushing my tank further than I would normally be comfortable with. It was not until almost 2 weeks after I had safely arrived in Arizona and started my new job that I found out, through a local news story that a coworker happened to share in our office group chat, completely unrelated to my own experience, that a man matching a very similar description had been arrested in New Mexico in connection with a string of incidents involving solo female travelers at gas stations and rest stops along that same general stretch of interstate. The article described a pattern of behavior remarkably similar to what I had experienced. Someone who would follow travelers from one stop to the next, apparently looking for situations where a woman appeared isolated enough to approach without witnesses nearby. I remember sitting at my desk reading that article, feeling a mix of relief and delayed fear all at once. The kind of fear that hits you retroactively once you realize just how close you might have come to a situation far worse than simply feeling uneasy. I never found out for certain whether the man arrested was the same person I had encountered that day, since the article did not include enough identifying details for me to be fully sure. And I did not pursue contacting authorities to confirm it directly, mostly because nothing had actually happened to me, and I did not want to complicate an ongoing investigation with an account that might not even be relevant. Looking back now, 5 years later, what stays with me most is not any single dramatic moment, since nothing dramatic actually happened to me directly. What stays with me is the accumulation of small, quiet warning signs, the slightly too long glance, the engine left running, the unhurried walk toward the store entrance, all things that on their own could have meant nothing at all, but together painted a picture that my instincts recognized as dangerous long before my rational mind could fully justify why. I still drive long distances by myself sometimes, and I do not want this experience to have made me permanently afraid of doing things I genuinely enjoy. But I am far more careful now than I used to be. I choose busier stations. I trust that uneasy feeling in my stomach far more readily than I used to, and I no longer feel embarrassed about leaving a gas pump mid-fill and driving away if something feels wrong, even if it turns out afterward that nothing actually happens. Because sometimes, the most frightening thing is not knowing for certain whether you escaped something dangerous or whether your instincts simply overreacted to an ordinary situation. And I think that particular uncertainty, that unresolved question that I will probably never have a complete answer to, is what has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that entire road trip. Okay, now we start our fifth story. I have never told this story publicly before, mostly because for a long time, I was not sure how to explain it without sounding like I was making things up for attention. But it happened almost exactly the way I am about to describe it, and even now, working a completely different job in a completely different state, I still keep a full tank of gas in my car at all times, just in case, because of what happened that one night. Back when I was 23, I worked part-time at a 24-hour gas station just outside a mid-sized town in Texas, mostly to help cover expenses while I finished up some night classes at a local community college. The station was part of a larger chain, well-maintained, brightly lit, with modern digital pumps and a decent-sized convenience store attached. It was not the kind of isolated, run-down place people usually imagine when they think of a scary gas station story. It was busy, close to a major road, with cameras everywhere and a direct line to a regional security office that monitored several locations at once. I want to emphasize that, because it is part of what made what happened so unsettling. This was not some abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. It was a normal, modern, well-secured place. I usually worked the overnight shift, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and I had been doing that same shift for about 4 months by the time this happened, so I was fairly used to the rhythm of overnight work. Most nights were uneventful, the occasional trucker, some late-night convenience store regulars, and long stretches of quiet where I would restock shelves or study for my classes. The night this happened started out completely normal. It was a weeknight, business was slow, and by around 1 in the morning, I had not had a customer in almost 40 minutes. Then, without warning, the power went out. Not just at the station, but seemingly across the entire area, since I could see through the front windows that the streetlights outside had gone dark as well, along with the illuminated signs of a fast food place across the street. The station had a backup generator, which was standard for that chain, so within about 10 seconds, the emergency lighting kicked in, along with a few essential systems, though most of the regular lighting and the pumps themselves stayed offline. I remember feeling annoyed more than scared at first, mostly thinking about the hassle of dealing with a power outage and whether I would need to call it in to the regional office or wait for it to resolve on its own. I tried calling the regional security line, the number we were trained to use for exactly this kind of situation, and got nothing but a strange, looping, busy signal, which was not normal. I tried my cell phone next and found that I had no signal at all, not even 1 bar, despite normally getting decent reception at that location. I told myself it was probably related to whatever had caused the wider power outage, maybe a downed line affecting nearby cell towers as well, and tried not to let it worry me too much. About 15 minutes into the outage, I heard the front door mechanism click, the automatic lock engaging on its own. That door was supposed to remain unlocked at all times during operating hours, even during a power outage, specifically for safety reasons, so that employees were never trapped inside. I walked over and tried the handle, and it would not budge. I checked the manual override switch near the door frame, which was designed specifically to bypass the electronic lock in situations exactly like this, and it did nothing. The door stayed firmly locked. At that point, I started to feel real unease, though I was still trying to rationalize it as some kind of electrical malfunction related to the power outage, maybe a short circuit in the door's control system that had caused it to fail in the locked position rather than the unlocked one it was supposed to default to. I walked to the back of the store, toward the small office where the manager usually worked during day shifts, thinking I could use the office phone, a separate line from the one at the front counter, to try calling for help again. That door was also locked, despite normally being left open during overnight shifts, specifically so employees could access the restroom and break area located just beyond it. I remember standing in the middle of the store at that point, completely alone, both exits sealed. No cell signal, emergency lighting casting everything in a dim reddish glow, and feeling a kind of fear that was different from anything I had experienced before. Not the sudden jolt of fear you get from something jumping out at you, but a slow, creeping dread that built up gradually as each normal, reliable system around me failed to work the way it was supposed to. I checked the security monitor behind the counter, which was thankfully still functioning on backup power, showing the 4 camera feeds from around the store. Everything looked normal on the feeds themselves, no other people visible anywhere. Just the empty aisles and the dark, quiet lot outside. That should have been reassuring, but somehow it made things feel worse, since it confirmed I really was completely alone and completely locked in, with no clear explanation for why. About 30 minutes into this, sitting behind the counter trying to stay calm, I heard a sound from the back of the store, near the storage room. It was not overly loud. Just a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like knuckles against metal shelving, coming from somewhere back near the walk-in cooler. I froze, listening carefully, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling, or some mechanical system cycling on and off due to the generator taking over. The tapping continued for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, stopped, and then started again a minute or two later, this time sounding slightly closer to the main store area. I grabbed the small flashlight we kept behind the counter for exactly this kind of situation and walked slowly toward the back, telling myself I needed to check it out rather than just sit there imagining the worst. The storage room was empty. Everything looked normal, boxes stacked the way they always were, the walk-in cooler door closed and functioning normally despite the power situation, running on its own separate backup system. I checked behind shelving units, in corners, anywhere a person could realistically be hiding, and found nothing. I told myself, somewhat unconvincingly even to myself in the moment, that the sound had probably come from some part of the building structure adjusting to the temperature change or the backup power system cycling in ways I was not familiar with. I walked back toward the front counter, and that is when I noticed something that genuinely still gives me chills thinking about it now. The security monitor, which had shown 4 completely normal, empty camera feeds only a few minutes earlier, now showed static on exactly one of the 4 feeds, the one covering the storage room I had just walked out of. The other 3 feeds remained perfectly clear. I stood there staring at that static feed for what felt like a long time, trying to come up with any logical explanation. Maybe a loose camera cable, maybe some kind of electrical interference specific to that one camera. Whatever the explanation, I did not want to go back there and check the physical connection myself, not after everything else that had already happened that night. Around 2 in the morning, roughly an hour into the whole ordeal, the power came back on all at once, the regular lighting flickering back to life, the pumps outside reactivating with their usual electronic hum, and importantly, the front door's automatic lock disengaging with an audible click. I walked over immediately and tested the handle, and it opened without any resistance at all, exactly the way it was supposed to work. My cell phone signal returned within a few minutes as well, and I immediately called the regional security office, this time getting through without any issue. I explained everything that had happened, the locked doors, the failed manual overrides, the strange tapping sound, and the static camera feed. The person on the other end of the line took detailed notes and told me they would review the footage from that time period and get back to me, though she also mentioned somewhat carefully that they had not actually recorded any power outage on their end for that location during that time window, which confused me even further, since I had clearly experienced the lights going out along with the emergency backup lighting kicking in. I never got a clear follow-up explanation from the company about what had actually happened that night. About a week later, my manager mentioned during a shift change that the review of the security footage from that specific hour showed some kind of recording gap. Essentially about 45 minutes of missing footage across all 4 cameras, rather than just the one that had shown static to me in real time. The official explanation given to him from higher up was a vague reference to a technical malfunction with the recording server. Something about a scheduled update that had apparently gone wrong that same night, though he admitted even he found the timing and the specifics a little too convenient to fully believe. I finished out my shifts at that station for about another month after that, though I made sure never to work alone overnight again if I could help it, trading shifts with co-workers whenever possible until I eventually found a different job entirely. I never experienced anything quite like that again during my remaining time there. No more locked doors, no more strange tapping sounds, no more static feeds. But I also never got a real explanation for what had happened that one specific night, and the fact that the actual recorded footage showed a completely different story than what I personally lived through, an unexplained gap instead of the outage and lockdown I clearly experienced, has stuck with me far more than almost anything else from that entire period of my life. I do not know what caused it. I do not know if it was some kind of elaborate system malfunction that happened to align in the worst possible way, or something else entirely that I do not have the right framework to fully understand. What I do know is that even now, working a job that has nothing to do with gas stations or overnight retail, I still feel a specific kind of unease whenever I am somewhere alone late at night and the power flickers, even briefly, and I still, out of habit, keep my phone fully charged and my car's gas tank topped off, just in case I ever find myself needing to get somewhere quickly, away from wherever I happen to be. Okay, now we're starting our 6th story. The following is a set of journal entries I kept during a really strange week a couple of years back. I want to share them exactly as I originally wrote them at the time, rather than rewriting the whole thing as a smooth narrative after the fact, because I think reading them in this format gives a better sense of how confused and increasingly scared I was as each day passed. I was working as a long-haul driver at the time, hauling freight mostly across the Midwest, and I kept a small notebook in my cab just to jot things down during long stretches of driving. I am including my original entries here, cleaned up slightly for readability, but otherwise as close to what I actually wrote as I can manage. Monday night, just past midnight. Long day. Started in Illinois this morning, heading toward a delivery in Nebraska. Stopped for gas around 11:30 at a station off the interstate, somewhere in Iowa, I think. Though honestly, the exits all start blending together after a while. Nothing special about the stop itself. Grabbed coffee, filled up, kept driving. Only writing this down because of something small that happened. The cashier, older guy, kind of quiet, said something odd when I paid. He said, "See you again soon," which is a normal enough thing to say, I guess, except something about how he said it felt strange. Probably just tired. Going to try to get a few hours of sleep at a rest area before continuing. Tuesday, late afternoon. Something weird happened today, and I want to write it down while it is fresh, because it is bugging me more than it probably should. I got back on the road this morning, continuing toward Nebraska, and somewhere around midday I needed gas again. Pulled off at what I thought was a completely different station, different exit, different town based on the signs along the highway. Walked in, and it was the same station. Same layout, same guy behind the counter, same exact conversation almost word for word, including him saying, "See you again soon" again when I paid. I actually asked him directly if he remembered me from the night before, and he just smiled and said everybody says that to him, that I must be thinking of somewhere else. I did not push it further, but I know what I saw. Same building, same guy, same everything. Chalking it up to exhaustion, and two very similar looking gas stations along the same general route. Still bugs me though. Wednesday, early morning, could not sleep, so writing this now. Did not make my delivery window yesterday like I planned. Ended up way behind schedule and honestly cannot fully explain why, since I do not remember losing that much time on the road. My logbook shows hours that do not quite add up right. More driving time logged than actual miles traveled would suggest, which almost never happens for me, since I am usually pretty careful about tracking things accurately for compliance reasons. Stopped for gas again last night. Different route this time. Deliberately avoided the interstate exit I had used the two previous times. Took a completely different state highway instead, specifically to avoid whatever coincidence had been happening. Pulled into a station that looked different at first from the road. Newer sign, different color scheme on the building. Walked inside, and it was the same layout again. Same guy behind the counter. He looked up at me before I even said anything and said, "Back again?" I left without buying anything, just got back in my truck and drove off, feeling genuinely rattled for the first time in this whole situation. Wednesday night, much later. Cannot stop thinking about this. Tried calling my dispatcher today to explain I was behind schedule and to check in about my route, and the call kept dropping every time I mentioned needing to double-check my location or asked about nearby exit numbers. Like something about that specific part of the conversation was causing the connection to fail. Worked fine talking about everything else. Probably just bad signal in this area, but the timing feels too specific to be a coincidence at this point. Have not stopped for gas today at all, running lower than I would like, but I genuinely do not want to risk pulling into that same station again. Going to push further than usual before stopping. Try to put real distance behind me. Thursday. Very early, still dark outside, ran out of options. Tank got too low to keep pushing, had no choice but to stop somewhere. Pulled off at an exit I've genuinely never used before in all my years driving this general route. Checked it twice against my GPS to be sure, completely different location. Miles away from anywhere I had stopped earlier this week. Walked into the station, and I am writing this sitting in my truck in the parking lot right now, because my hands are still shaking too much to feel comfortable driving yet. Same station, same exact layout down to the placement of the shelves. Same guy behind the counter, except this time he did not say anything at all when I walked in. Just watched me the entire time I was inside, with an expression I genuinely cannot fully describe. Somewhere between sad and knowing, like he expected this outcome the whole time. I paid as fast as I could and left without saying a word either. Thursday, later that same day, stopped at a rest area. Called my company's main office instead of my usual dispatcher, explained everything as calmly as I could manage, leaving out the parts that would make me sound like I was losing my mind, just focusing on the fact that my logged hours and mileage were not adding up correctly and that I was worried something was wrong with my truck's tracking system. They pulled up my GPS data while I was on the phone with them, and the person on the line got quiet for a moment, before telling me that, according to their system, I had been circling the exact same general area of Iowa for the past 3 days, despite my logbook and my own memory clearly showing me believing I had continued driving toward Nebraska the entire time. She asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed to pull over and rest, standard concern for driver fatigue, which I understood completely given how it must have sounded from her side. Friday, writing this from a motel room, refused to keep driving until I got real sleep in an actual bed. Company arranged for someone to come relieve me and take over the delivery, chalking the whole thing up officially to driver fatigue and GPS malfunction, which I did not argue against because I genuinely do not have a better explanation to offer them. Before the relief driver arrived, I made myself drive past that exit one more time, in daylight this time, specifically to see it clearly rather than through tired eyes at night. The station was there. Looked completely normal in the daylight, ordinary building, ordinary signage, nothing at all unsettling about it visually. I did not go inside. I did not need to. I already knew what I would find. Saturday, back home now, finishing this entry before I put the notebook away. I do not have a clean explanation for what happened that week, and I have mostly stopped trying to come up with one. My best guess, if I am being honest with myself, is some combination of severe exhaustion, a genuinely confusing stretch of similar-looking exits along that part of the interstate, and a GPS system that glitched at exactly the wrong time to make things even more disorienting than they already were. I want that explanation to be enough, and most days it almost is. But I still remember that guy's face on the last night, the way he looked at me without saying anything at all, like he had seen this exact same thing play out before with other drivers, other tired people passing through that same stretch of highway late at night. And I still take a different route now whenever a delivery would normally send me through that part of Iowa, adding almost an hour to my trip every single time, just to avoid ever finding out whether that station is still there, waiting for the next driver whose schedule and exhaustion line up in just the wrong way. I am not asking anyone reading this to believe there was anything supernatural going on. I genuinely do not know what happened that week. I just know I wrote these entries in real time, as things happened, without knowing yet how the whole situation would end. And reading back through them now still makes my hands feel a little unsteady, the same way they did sitting in that parking lot on Thursday morning, trying to convince myself that what I had just experienced again was somehow impossibly a coincidence.